All right. Well, welcome everyone to the 2024 P100 training, Getting to Know P100. We had a lot of requests for a more public training about P100. GSA has the opportunity to work with amazing design teams and contractors all around the country. And we wanted to make sure that you had the best knowledge available to you so that you could do the best possible work that you can. And so this is part of that process. And real quick, I am Lance Davis. I am the sustainability architect for GSA, and I'm also the manager of P100. And so I get to work with an amazing team of people to help put together this document. So today we're going to be going into lots of aspects of P100, and we're going to be getting into just a general introduction of who is GSA, PBS, and P100. I'll go over sort of what is really the P100 and how it gets used. And then we'll start going through all the topic areas, and you can see some of the speakers listed for each of these groups in case you need to reach out to anyone in the future. But we'll be hitting everything from sustainability and envelope, architecture and interior, landscape, all the way through fire protection. We'll also hit on some of the specialty spaces that we do at GSA and some special requirements we have associated with that, dealing with electric vehicles. And then finally wrap up with the appendix and some really useful tools that should be beneficial for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Natalie Huber, who will introduce us into who is GSA. So Natalie.
Great, thanks, Lance. Yeah, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's training session on our P100. I'm Natalie Huber. I am the Office of Architecture and Engineering's Chief Engineer and the Director of the Engineering Division in GSA's Central Office. For those of you that aren't familiar with GSA's Public Building Service, we are essentially serving as the landlord for the federal civilian government. So the PBS portfolio is comprised of federal office buildings, federal courthouses, and land ports of entry on the Canadian and Mexican borders that are operated by Customs and Border Protection. So in total, PBS is responsible for nearly 400 million square feet of space and over 1 million federal employees in our spaces. So it's exciting to have everyone here today as we dive into this important topic. This affects not just how we design federal buildings, but also how we ensure they meet the highest standards for safety, functionality, sustainability, and resilience, to name a few things. The P100 that we're going to go over today was developed by the P100 Steering Committee, a team of GSA's senior subject matter experts from various disciplines ranging, as Lance said, from architecture and engineering to sustainability and accessibility. And the committee's expertise has really allowed us to create a set of requirements that reflect the diverse needs of federal agencies and the public they serve. So these standards aren't just technical documents, they really embody the values and priorities of the federal government. They focus on creating environments that are inclusive, efficient, resilient, and environmentally responsible, ensuring that federal buildings are models of excellence and innovation. The P100 is designed to provide a consistent framework across all federal building projects, ensuring that our designs reflect really a cohesive vision no matter where they're implemented. So whether you're involved in new construction, renovations, or maintenance, understanding these requirements is crucial to delivering projects that meet federal goals and serve the public interest. So for the 2024 P100 update that we're going to go over today, this update was a significant effort. We update the P100 every 3 years. For this iteration, we received over 750 proposals that were received, and you can see a breakdown of those proposals here in the pie chart. There was a lot of activity in the areas of sustainability, electrical engineering, and building enclosures, which have definitely been a focus of ours over the last few years, particularly as there's been an emphasis on sustainability and how we can make our buildings as efficient as possible. So in all, this update was a 10-month process to review and analyze the proposals for potential incorporation into the P100, and a little over half of the proposals we received were accepted. The new P100 was released in May of this year, and it's been required for all owned projects starting after August 1st of this year. And so now I'd like to just take a minute to kind of introduce Lance as well. He is the program manager, as he said, for the P100. He leads the steering committee responsible for this update. And to brag on Lance for just a moment, his ability to really balance all of the technical details, all of the stakeholder input, and the long-term vision for federal building design has been really crucial in ensuring that the updated standards that we're going to go over today are, really comprehensive, practical, and industry leading. So, Lance, thanks for your leadership on this update, and thank you to the steering committee and everyone at GSA that contributed to the update. And Lance, I'll turn it back over to you to get us going.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right, so we're going to start with our sort of first section, getting to know P100. So the first big thing that everyone needs to know is that P100 is mandatory. If you are working on GSA's owned inventory, you should absolutely expect to see P100 as part of your contract. And you can see we have lots of numbers down there that may be meaningless to you, but they represent all the different types of construction that we're doing on our buildings. And that obviously is new construction, minor and major repairs and alterations. A lot of times we spend operating funds to fix things within our buildings. And so those operating funds also are required to meet P100. We work on energy rebates occasionally, as well as historic preservation within our buildings. And then a lot of times we have other federal agencies that give us money to renovate the space that they're in within a GSA building for them. And so that work would also be required to utilize P100. And then finally, ESPC work or funding from outside of GSA. If it's happening within a GSA-owned building, then P100 is also mandatory. So really trying to cover the full gamut there, trying to make sure that anytime you're doing work within a GSA building that's owned, that P100, you should be downloading that and double checking the work you're doing in relationship to the P100. Next piece here I want to explain is that a few years ago, almost 10 years now, we moved to a mostly performance-based requirements. And so the reason we do this is because our projects are from Alaska to Puerto Rico. And there's a lot of different climate zones. There's a lot of different construction types and techniques. There's a lot of different contractors in between that enormous amount of land area. And so by providing performance requirements, it gives our design teams the opportunity to figure out what is the best solution for that particular building on that site for that client, and with the requirements that they have. And so it gives them those opportunities to really figure that out. And you can see here, this is a sample out of P100 dealing with our water net zero requirements. And we have a baseline that sets where the project is starting from. And then we have 3 tiers that have increased performance. And so that baseline's talking about 15% of the potable water has to be reused on site. And then the tier 1 raises that up. And you can see how those tiers continue to raise for the different types of buildings. And then we have some information related to those performance requirements down below, dealing with what we're expecting to see from calculations or what we're seeing from a construction standpoint as it relates to these items. We also then, right after we have these tables within P100, we generally have a prescriptive requirements that relate to those performance items. So here is the one for that water net zero. It's giving you more information about that particular requirement that wasn't necessarily appropriate or was too long to put into the performance table. So here talking about the National Blue Ribbon Commission and definitions as it relates to what is recycled water, things like that. the requirement to use the EPA Reuse Explore tool. So that just should give you a sense. We have performance, generally followed by prescriptive. And then we also have, in some cases, whole sections that are just prescriptive. And so this is just a good example of one that deals with rainwater catchment. And so really pointing out that the standard that we're using for rainwater catchment is this ARCSA ASPE ANSI standard 63-2020. And so you can then find that and go, okay, I understand what I have to do for this particular situation. Additionally, we have another interesting aspect within our facilities. Because a lot of times we're dealing with very critical infrastructure and agencies that are extremely important during various events, we've had to go and identify our different types of buildings and give them actual definitions. So there's an essential facility, there's a critical action facility, and there's a mission critical facility. And each one of these has different requirements that are spelled out during or throughout P100. And so if you're working on one of these types of buildings, then you can find those additional requirements in P100. And obviously, as we're in hurricane season, someone like FEMA, we would probably fall into one or more of these categories here. And we would want to make sure that their building that they're in stays operational so that they can get the resources out to the people that need them as quickly as possible. This just gives you a sense of all the chapters that we have. We're trying to cover all of the major disciplines that most of our design teams have out there, structural, civil, electrical, all of that. So pretty easy to navigate through that. And then, of course, we have an appendix within P100 that has a lot more sort of reference information and a lot of tools available for your use. So as a start off point, P100 generally uses the I codes as a base. And then P100 builds from that. And so there's 368 pages, I think, that says all the things that are different with doing a GSA project compared to the building codes. And that's an important, I think, understanding. A lot of what we do, a lot of what's in P100 is related to legislation, to executive orders, and then to what we've learned about our buildings over time. One of the interesting things about GSA is we're holding on to our buildings usually well over 100+ years. And so how we deal with operations and maintenance, how we look at the longevity of materials is really important to us. And so these are things that we pay attention to in P100. And we do, obviously, we're building in cities and states all over the country. And we look to those local codes and we try our best to follow them and utilize them as practical when they're more stringent than P100. Being a federal entity, we do have some leeway in what we're allowed to do. But for the most part, we are trying to work very closely with state and local code officials and make sure certainly our buildings are connected to their infrastructure appropriately and that we're working with them hand in hand on those sort of things. That is an area where we're trying to be as practical as possible. And so with that, we'll continue to talk as we get into sustainability, but also want to bring in Walter Terse so that he can introduce himself real quick. Walter, you out there?
Sustainability Program Manager, work closely with Lance. I'm the chair of the P100 Sustainability Committee as well.
Sounds good. All right. So let me get slides adjusted here and great. So we're going to start off with one of our areas in our performance aspect, which is energy net zero. And so in that, Want to give just a basic understanding of what energy net zero means to us. We're really looking at what is the energy usage of a particular building, that EUI. And then from there, we want our design teams to figure out what does it mean, how many panels, how much renewable energy would we need on site to offset that EUI. And in some cases, we might have a very large site like this that we have some land that we can put some renewable energy. Other cases, you may be in a downtown location on a multi-story building, and that ability is greatly limited. But the idea here is for us to have a clear understanding, a drawing, and a calculation that really shows what is possible on that building and what would be required to make it happen. So for here, you can see a simple little calculation. It shows what the EUI is. It shows roughly how many panels would be needed to offset that EUI per year. Shows, you know, hey, maybe you're putting some panels on this section of the building, but because of budgetary reasons, you can't put the full amount on, but you have locations identified as to where you might go. So this rooftop here, or maybe this area out in the landscape. And then as you're doing that and you're thinking about it, you're also thinking about those pathways and connectors between the panels in the building. We don't want to have to rip up valuable infrastructure we've put in place so that we can then run conduits in the future. So being smart, thinking forward, doing those sort of things. And you can see over here on the side how the tiers start to step up, being able to install some amount of renewables, either being with the baseline being net zero ready, meaning no panels are actually installed, but you've thought about it, you know how many it's going to take, you've thought about those pathways, you've designed those in. And then the tier 1, 2, and 3 are actually installing those pathways or installing those renewables into the project. The next item is water net zero. And so this is following that same sort of idea. We've now set, we've been looking at what's been happening in the industry, looking at where we're seeing various resilience actions happening, and looking at our new construction, starting off with the baseline of 15% of the potable water has to be reused or infiltrated on site. Looking for those opportunities to start to bring in some filtration systems, looking for ways for that water that can be used, and then coordinating with our stormwater management along the way. And then those tiers increase based on the performance items. The other area that we have in this section is our green proving ground. So we work with new technologies that are being developed. We have a large portfolio, and we look to install some of these new technologies in our portfolio, work with the national labs to do a very robust M&V on these materials and develop these amazing reports about the technology. And so that allows us to do that, and we want to then install, once these technologies prove out, we want to start installing these into our projects going forward. All right.
So I'll jump in here for 3 slides, and then Lance and I will tag team it a little. We added a new conservation pyramid into the 2024 P100 to mention upfront and explicitly that conservation is the foundation of high performance building efficiency. So getting the low hanging fruit first. Energy conservation, daylighting set points, schedules, and closures, then investing in new equipment such as more efficient HVAC or water heating systems, before finally resorting to adding renewable energy equipment on site. So we're not doing things like just slapping solar panels on top of an existing building. You want to really focus on conservation and efficiency first. Another foundation we have for federal sustainability, because it's required by executive order and has been for almost 15 years, is the guiding principles for federal sustainable buildings. So these have a lot of overlap with LEED, and we do capitalize on those overlaps using the checklist we use to track the guiding principles, which we call our sustainable design checklist. And these help integrate sustainable design best practices into our projects from concept design through operation. So you'll see these 6 categories look pretty familiar to everybody familiar with LEED: integrated design, energy, water, indoor environmental quality, materials, and then resilience. Resilience is probably the biggest area where the guiding principles go further than LEED. These are required by executive order, and they are in our scopes of work, P100, and contract language. Then we also have LEED certification. So this is something that's well understood because it's been around for a long time. At GSA, we've been requiring LEED for over 20 years, and it is a system that Lance and others have helped develop, and we've been requiring LEED Gold since 2010. So it's pretty straightforward. P100 2024 requires version 4 or version 4.1, and we're closely monitoring version 5. For now, it's optional but encouraged, and GSA studies third-party certification systems. So this is required for our new construction and major modernization projects. And then for partial modernizations and limited scopes, it's really a case-by-case determination based on what's achievable based on the project's scope. And then I'll let Lance talk about electrification. Thank you. Here you go.
Thanks, Walter. So electrification is one of the newer things that we've been adding in the last couple of years. GSA, there's lots of different definitions for electrification out there. GSA went ahead and defined it for our particular buildings. And so we are looking to electrify our owned inventory, and for everything from heating and ventilation and air conditioning, as well as domestic water heating, cooking, laundry, and demand response generators powered on site. So pretty broad range. We're really looking to reduce our emissions from our projects. And we have recognizing, we have projects that are in various states, both new construction and minor projects, repair and alterations, things like that. And so within P100, we go more in depth about how all of this electrification works for those types of projects. And then I think just the real point here is that if you're working on a GSA-owned building and you're seeing that you're putting in something that has emissions, you need to be asking yourself, is that really the right thing per P100? Because I know that GSA requires electrification. We do obviously recognize that in some really cold aspects of the country, that supplemental fossil fuel may be needed for peak heating, and so we address that within P100 as well. But for the most part, throughout the country, we were looking to really electrify. Want to make sure everyone understands along with all of this, and I'll talk a little bit more about life cycle costing, but that this is an economic analysis method. The Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, does require us to utilize LCC, and then the Office of Management and Budget also requires us to look at all of these various aspects of a building in relationship to that life cycle cost analysis. So that's a part of P100, and it's identified what's required to do, what's required for all of these various aspects in it. A new item that we added this year, a requirement, is that we're looking to make sure our buildings are grid interactive, efficient buildings. I think this graph just really explains what this is really well, that a typical building has generally a peak load happening to it. An energy efficient building reduces that. If you get a building with some renewable energy, you start to get the interesting curve there. And then a grid integrated building looks to smooth all of that out. And that greatly helps our power producers in various locations of the country. They then don't have to crank up additional power generation, and it really helps their process overall. And so having that communication, having that ability to communicate with them in real time so that our buildings can more appropriately respond to the grid is beneficial for us and for the grid in general. We're also getting more attuned to the materials we're putting into our buildings. Walter will tell you more about what we're doing with the low embodied carbon materials. But we're now also looking towards materials that are biomimic, looking at nature and how nature designs materials. We're really pushing this idea of salvaged materials because a salvaged material essentially comes to us with low or no embodied carbon associated with it. And it gives us an opportunity to really use some beautiful historic materials in our projects, and then looking at regenerative materials, materials that are healthy and better for the environment and for us as humans as well.
Thank you. So we do have a requirement in here for low embodied carbon concrete. This has been added to P100 for 3 years now. And essentially it applies to all of our projects of all types. They use at least 10 cubic yards or 1 truck's worth, roughly, of one or more concrete mix types. So we do have specific, generally more stringent requirements that apply to our Inflation Reduction Act funded projects. But we do require an environmental product declaration for all concrete and asphalt where at least 10 cubic yards of a mix type is used in P100. So that applies across the board. We can approve waivers for P100 where material with this environmental product declaration, or essentially environmental impact facts declaration, is unavailable, but we do require a global warming potential estimate so that we can build a baseline of what types of materials we're getting. So we've had projects apply both the concrete and asphalt standards over the past few years. For asphalt, we still require the EPD, but it's a little bit more qualitative in terms of picking two. So high recycled, reclaimed asphalt pavement content, or bio-based materials, recycled plastic, or roof shingles, warm mix technology, etc. So that's been going pretty well, and we've been excited to see some companies develop, for example, their first asphalt EPD in 5 weeks just because GSA asked. And then this last slide that I'm covering before I hand it back to Lance to close out our sustainability and resilience section is about work we're doing to help decarbonize the actual construction process. So there's a lot of consider and encourage aspects on this slide, such as consider whether offsite construction can be used. Consider green credentialed construction personnel, such as Green Advantage. We do, however, require at least 50% construction demolition waste diversion. And also we require an assessment of materials that could be salvaged where there's some demolition work being done. We also have a new requirement for 2024 about the contractors' commitment. So this good level, which is their lowest level, does require things like tracking fuel and utility usage for corporate operations. So the contractors' commitment helps ensure that our contractors are more sustainable in their own operations. And then Lance, you added this new material equity section, right?
Yeah, so just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of this. Child and forced labor has been part of the acquisition aspects of the federal government for some time, but we want to make sure that our design teams are really aware where the products they're specifying are coming from and that they do not use child or forced labor. It's an area that's growing in the construction community, and we need to do better about being aware of it. Additionally, the use of PFAS in materials. We're seeing this starting to ramp up, and so we want to be very careful about anything that is specified that contains PFAS or forever chemicals. And then moving into our resilience section, really just understanding We want to be able to manage climate-related and extreme weather risks in our buildings, because a lot of times our projects are housing the agencies that are responding to these events. And so we want to make sure that they're safeguarding and that we're safeguarding our assets overall. And then looking at thermal resilience as it relates to our buildings. So in some cases, especially for our mission critical facilities, if we're in a situation where the power is out or where the water is not able to be supplied through municipal means, how can that building remain functional? How do we make that work so where that a response agency can be in that building and continue to work as needed to get their efforts out? And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Frank Giblin to tell you a little bit about community planning. Frank?
Thanks, Lance. So my name is Frank Giblin, and I'm the director of GSA's Center for Community Planning and Design. You might also know us as the Good Neighbor Program. Our requirements for community planning in the P100 are a little bit different than some of the other disciplines that we're hearing about today. Our requirements are primarily process-based, and I'll get to those in a second. So some of you might know that GSA came into existence in 1949. Around that same time, Congress was already seeing that it's very important that when federal agencies do real estate investment, that we look for ways to get multiple returns. So it's something that's been held dear by Congresses and administrations over the years, that it's just basic common sense that when we're doing federal investment for a facility purpose, that we also try to achieve other federal goals. And a lot of that is fleshed out at the local level. So we have a series of laws and executive orders from the Public Buildings Amendments that talks about being collaborative with our design approaches and even addresses landscape and site security. We have a long series of executive orders that touches on where buildings should be located and how we should get local input on where to locate buildings, how to emphasize historic buildings and districts, sustainability, environmental justice, and even with something like the Public Buildings Cooperative Use Act, how can we find ways to share our properties in ways that provide benefit to the community? So some of these elements are things that are part of the design process. Many of them are things that are helped or enabled by the design process. And so we're looking for those opportunities on our projects. The theme throughout all of them, though, is at the bottom here, which is we want to see the design teams consult with local stakeholders, and then where we can leverage our project in support of multiple returns. What are the things that the community cares about? Where feasible. We understand that our primary directive is to meet the needs of the client agencies, but if we can do that in a way that has multiple returns, then that's a great thing. So this is basically, it's a responsibility, we call it, and we use the term leverage quite a bit. We want to leverage our projects in support of those local planning goals. I mentioned the laws and executive orders that apply here. A lot of these things do intersect with NEPA. But there's something that happens at a finer grain in most cases, and areas where there might not be a significant impact from a NEPA perspective could be of interest or concern to the community. And so we're looking to address those things as well. But obviously it would be closely coordinated with our NEPA efforts. So there's 3 sections of the community planning requirements. I'll touch on all of them, but only really dive into one. Sustainable locations for a lot of projects is going to be something that you're not going to be able to control as the design team. But still, the P100 still lays those location factors out as design elements or design goals for our projects. We can help project teams address these issues, but it's mainly these elements crosswalk already with LEED version 4. So teams should come into a project well versed in that, and they can address these other issues: walkability, transportation access, that we want to have in as a design standard. But again, these are things that are largely not into the control of the design team. The collaborative design process, however, is, and I'll get into some more detail on that in a second. And then lastly, I won't go into detail on this, but we want to see our design processes look for opportunities to provide public use. The easiest example is the use of jury assembly suites for potential after-hours use by the community. That's an easy one because it's something that's in a lot of our core programs for new courthouses, and the features and the kind of setup that works well for our client, the courts, happens to be the thing that would also work well for community use. So we're looking for those kinds of opportunities, and there's details in the P100 about how we'd like to see that addressed, but it's usually an easy and very positive get. We want to see the same approach on exteriors. We want the discussion about exterior design to think of it as a programmed area. And there's, like most of these elements, there's not a hard requirement on it, but we want to see design teams looking for opportunities as much as they can. Excuse me. So the one that I will dive into is on the collaborative design process. And like Lance said, we're performance-based. We have a baseline requirement, and we have tiers that are a higher level of performance. I'll only address the baseline now, but in short, what we're looking for is for the design process to consider the input of local officials, digest that during the process, and have that be part of the discussion as the design is refined and as GSA approves that design. So what projects does this apply to? Essentially, it's any significant project that has a potential impact on the public realm. And you feel free to use air quotes around that. That's certainly virtually every new construction property or project. It might also be a renovation project, such as you might see on the far left there, where perimeter security, edge use designs of our properties could have an impact on the local public realm for positive or negative. And then other elements, how the property fits into a district and that kind of thing. But if the project impacts the public realm, we want the design teams to look at it as an opportunity. So just in a nutshell, what we're looking for, and some of these things are handled by the GSA project team even before AE might be on board, is to have the project team have a sit down and a download with local officials. This wouldn't necessarily be at this stage, be the sharing of design elements. It should be an effort to understand the design context and the local aspirations for the area before we start putting pen to paper. So it's an information download, nothing much more complicated than that. And we have some tips and guidelines and can provide assistance on that. And then based on those meetings with local officials, when you learn more about the context, we want to see something that we call a community stakeholder analysis, which identifies what we think are the key stakeholders of the project, what their interests or concerns are, what a win is for them, how they might influence the project. We want to have that be part of the conversation. And a community engagement plan is much more succinct than it might sound from the title. What we're looking for there is an understanding of context, an understanding of local aspirations and opportunities, and then an accounting of how did we address that. And we don't expect every discussion with the community that identifies something that they're interested in to be something that we can never necessarily achieve on their behalf. But we want to have that be part of the design discussion. I'll stop there and turn it over to Brandon Hartz to discuss landscape design.
Hello, my name is Brandon Hartz. I'm a senior landscape architect in the Center for Community Planning and Design, and I'll be going over our landscape design standards, which are the second half of Chapter 2 in P100. So we won't dive right into the standards. First, I want to talk about the site certification. So a lot of you joining the call today are probably already familiar with the LEED rating system, which is a rating system for sustainable buildings. Well, sites is a rating system, but instead of for buildings, it's for sustainable landscapes. And we have a requirement within Chapter 2 of P100 that all of our capital projects that have a significant amount of site work earn at minimum a Site Silver certification. And this is equivalent to earning a minimum of 85 points out of a total of 200. On the left-hand side of the screen, I have the 10 sections of the site's rating system. These closely mirror the way that we've structured our landscape design standards within P100. And sites is based on the concept of ecosystem services. These are all the benefits that we as humanity receive from nature. These are things like our clean air, clean water, flood control, carbon sequestration, climate regulation, etc. Here's a snapshot of our GSA sites portfolio. We have 9 site certified projects to date under our belt, and we've got about a dozen more in the pipeline in various stages of progress. And I expect over the coming years, we should see a lot more popping up in the northern half of the United States, which will give us a more complete geographic distribution of site certified properties. Now, for the rest of the presentation, I've created some categories to speak on. And the first one of these categories will be water. So in the context of landscape design, what we mean by water is both stormwater management as well as the use of potable water. Starting with stormwater, the federal stormwater law is called the EVSE Section 438. So I'm going to talk about first what projects are subject to the law. Well, a project has to have at minimum a 5,000 square foot disturbance footprint. This is roughly the equivalent size of a basketball court. And it's got to be a non-maintenance activity, and it has to represent a change in use. So the conversion of an open space to a parking lot would trigger the law, but restriping that parking lot or doing some replanting would not. And the law requires that we capture and infiltrate or reuse the resulting runoff from the 95th percentile storm event. In GSA, within our landscape design standards, we prioritize the use of nature-based solutions. These are solutions that work with natural systems in order to manage stormwater. Some examples would be rain gardens, bioswales, bioretention cells, green streets, tree planting, green roofs, permeable pavements, etc. I've got 2 images here on the screen. The one on the left is a facility in Washington, D.C. The one on the right is a facility in Columbus, New Mexico. And although both of these federal properties are in very different climate profiles, they both effectively use nature-based solutions to both manage stormwater on these properties, as well as reduce or eliminate the need for water use for irrigation. The second category I want to talk about is biodiversity. And in the context of P100, when we talk about biodiversity, we mean the building of healthy soils, specifying appropriate plants, and supporting pollinator communities. Regarding soil management, we need to understand what a healthy soil is and the particular environments where we are developing and delivering federal landscapes. And we need to be matching a reference soil with how we are amending our soils. Regarding vegetation, we should strive to preserve existing vegetation, especially mature trees, wherever they already exist on our sites. And when we are introducing new plant species, we should be prioritizing native species. And those are the species which already have formed an evolutionary relationship with the animals indigenous to that area and provide wildlife support. And lastly, when we talk about pollinators, these are our bees, our birds, our bats, our butterflies, our moths, our flies, our beetles, all of the species that provide pollination services, which are really essential for healthy functioning ecosystems and our food supply. And we've got very robust standards within P100 for providing nesting opportunities for these animals, as well as foraging support. Regarding human-centered design and well-being, we want to ensure that we're providing safe and secure federal properties and helping to support human health. So by providing universal accessibility and wayfinding, that's kind of a given on every project, wherever we can, we want to work in educational opportunities for users of our sites. And Site Section 9 helps us to come up with those strategies in order to build in those educational components. Safety and security is absolutely paramount on all of our federal properties. And what we encourage projects to do is to work in physical security, landscape architectural solutions, starting at the very earliest concepts of design, using these integrated landscape architectural solutions to, 1, prevent us from having to do very costly building hardening or waiting till the very end of the project to put in a very ugly row of bollards or planters. And then lastly, I want to touch on operations and maintenance. What we'd like to do is during the design process, plan for sustainable operations and maintenance. have our design teams help our facility management understand what it's going to take to maintain these landscapes through the life cycle of the property, and engage facility management in a conversation as to what is possible. And lastly, I want to touch really briefly on landscape performance. You know, what is that iterative process? How do we learn from past projects that we've developed to help inform the next one as lessons learned? And we do this in two ways. So during design and construction, by utilizing the site's rating system process, it really gives us a framework to help us kind of identify those strategies which we want to employ. And most of our sites projects develop case studies. This is a credit within Section 9 to help document what were the decisions that were made, what were the credits that were earned, and what are the benefits that they're providing. So this can be provided to any A&E working on a GSA sites project. We've also gone ahead and posted this on our GSA landscape architecture website, so anyone from the public can come and download these case studies as well. And then once we've already constructed a project and the site is in use, we've awarded a number of landscape performance analytics reports, which allow us to go back into already constructed landscapes and help measure how they're actually, how are these sites actually performing in their built state? Are the assumptions we made during design actually playing out after construction? And so with these projects, we develop a research methodology. We install remote sensors, we collect data, we analyze that data, and then we come up with a bunch of conclusions, which then help inform future P100 policy and inform our O&M moving forward. We've also posted about a handful of these research studies on our GSA landscape architecture website for the public as well. And so that's it for chapter 2. On to Jason for exterior envelope.
All right, thanks, Brandon. My name's Jason Danielson. I'm the building envelope national architect. I'm also the committee chair for building enclosures or building envelopes. Jump to the next slide. So, and Lance hit this a little bit already early on, kind of talked about the essential facilities, critical action facilities, mission critical facilities. Here's kind of a snippet of where it's, actually in the P100. A lot of the building enclosure, building envelope we've started to refer to this, and because this is really starting to trigger higher performance requirements for some of these buildings that are under this definition, which Lance also touched on. Jump to the next one. So I'm going to break this down into these kind of, water penetration resistance, moisture and condensation control, air tightness, thermal performance, building enclosure, commissioning, and service life. I really kind of try to hit it in those. And a couple of these, the first two as well, or the water penetration as well as building enclosure and service life, I'll just kind of hit real quickly. We talked about the 1.3.9, which was what I just showed. That is really triggering water performance resistance to a higher tier level. So in that, we're getting into when, I won't get into the specifics on that one. We replaced the CW and AW design references with specific pressure requirements. We also linked that to the EVSE wind speed. So some of the areas where you might, you're getting into Miami, some of those areas are or they have something that is that higher or that 1.3.9 may trigger a higher performance requirement. And then the last thing as far as water penetration resistance is the 1/3 reduction, which is in AMA. As a building owner, we're more concerned with the delivered product. So we're removing that 1/3 reduction, but that teams are allowed to, if they want to test in the lab at that higher pressure, to kind of be able to be a little bit more conservative on that, they're able to do that. And then I'll jump to the building enclosure commissioning. That again, the 1.3.9, that triggers the enhanced commissioning. So that's just a little higher kind of requirements for the commissioning, as well as when that commissioning, or when the commissioning agent gets involved with that, or provider. Also within the enclosure commissioning is a verification of their vapor barrier during construction and talking about, different tools for that, infrared, smoke. We also identified ELD, and it was a scope reminder for the connectivity and overburden requirements for that ELD process. And we called out the test samplings. That's a little bit 2813, E2813 is a little bit vague with that as far as but what we have in there is we talk about a minimum of 2 test samplings per condition. And then we have the air, and we require the air and water for unproven assemblies. And then the final thing for commissioning kind of broadly is talking about mock-ups for new or atypical conditions. Hit service life. Service life, again, the 1.3.9, that triggers a longer service life for walls, fenestrations, and roofs, and to also design towards deferred maintenance. And then we included a section in here as far as for sealants, and talk about 2-stage sealant clarification, talk about redundancy in that sealant if you're using it in a barrier system. A lot of these things we're trying to reduce the reliance on sealants, but where you do rely on sealants for your, like I kind of talked about the barrier system, to have that backup, and when that does fail. So jump to the next slide. So the next slide will talk about moisture and condensation control, and this talks a lot about kind of hydrothermal analysis for unique or custom situations. Talk about 2D and 3D. There's 1-dimensional, 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional hydrothermal. Not to get too much into that, but it kind of goes from the larger facade all the way down to the kind of the mullion or that detail level. And depending on what your condition is and how you might have a kind of a very localized thermal bridge, understanding kind of where it may be appropriate for that 3-dimensional or maybe 2-dimensional. And so we kind of started to hit that a little bit more. We've got some references here. We start to talk about, the 1365 RP ASHRAE. And so we're really starting to kind of hit that a lot and talk about that. Jump to the next. All right, for air tightness, this again is another one, and this is another snippet, kind of the actual P100 and showing that the 1.3.9 again kind of triggers the fenestration for air tightness. This is one, so this we had done, and Bobby Wager may touch on this a little bit during his presentation in the mechanical, but this was one that was, we did a air infiltrate, or we did a ECM study with NIBS and DLR group. And as a result of that, we're finding that one of the critical, or something that really was an ECM that was really affected our and the paybacks were high, was that air tightness and tightening up our building. So as a result of that, we're going from that 0.25 to 0.17. And then also we have in tier 1 is a reference to FIAS, which is a 0.08. We also, then jump to the next slide. The quantitative and qualitative, we talk about that a little bit. And as far as the quantitative being a blower door test, qualitative again kind of infrared and smoke. And then the mention the garage doors as far as in the energy models, and this is for the where that garage door may be part of your thermal line or your air vapor line. If that garage door is not, and your air vapor barrier or your thermal is maybe at the inboard of that, maybe a basement garage or something like that at the first level of a courthouse, but understanding kind of where that line is. If it's not at the garage door, it's somewhere inboard. And then a recommendation of blower door tests before and after for R&A projects, repair and alteration projects, existing buildings, to kind of know where what that baseline is, and then what kind of improvement you're seeing. And jump to the next slide. And then for thermal performance, thermal bridging references, again, kind of ASHRAE 13.65 RP, BC Hydro, BETB guide, the low TEDI guide, a lot of this, again, kind of the thermal. We also talk about aged performance of materials, and to account for that aged material, and to start to think about the seasonal temperature range. Right now, like for instance, our insulations are tested at 70 degrees. We have a wider range in our building inventory, and some of these are, 0 degrees, maybe 110. But to understand kind of the performance of some of your materials at those extremes, at your seasonal range of temperatures. And okay, jump to the next. And then some more examples, and talk a little bit about the insulations and optional. There are some high performing insulations. There are different options here described, and some factors that are described as far as VIP panels and some others, and thinking of where you have requirements for maybe historic preservation, and you have a very limited kind of sandwich available, and to look at some of these other potential options. And I think that's it. You can jump to the next slide. Yep, thanks.
So good afternoon. My name is Tim Hansman. I'm an architect with Central Office. Next slide. The general architecture category is divided into 7 subsections. We'll just briefly go over each of the major categories that you see here. Next. A cornerstone is required, so please, keep this in mind. It's something that gets missed, and but it's also something that's very important in the design and in the cost estimate. So please know that this one is mandatory. Next. The Registry of Designers and Builders is not a requirement, but it is an opportunity. So what we did do is set a threshold, so you have to have at least 200 hours of service to be included in said registry. So just plan accordingly if it's something that the design team wishes to pursue during the project. Next. Promoting the use of stairs. Of course, GSA encourages the use of stairs for many reasons, and this is not only with if there's a grand staircase that's involved, but also just making the egress stairs more usable, more inviting for people to use. Next, please. The next section on vertical transportation, there was quite a bit of information that was added. Most of it is just to highlight the importance of the GSA regional transportation subject matter experts. So those SMEs are the authorities having jurisdiction, or the AHJs, for the vertical transportation programs in their regions. And therefore, the SME has to participate and has to be very much involved in each phase of the project, where the elevators, escalators, whatever might be involved are. And similar to code and ABAS and others, we reference the ASME A17.1 for elevators and escalators. So there's a lot of additional requirements that are found through that reference. Next, please. As you see, there's a number of categories. It's all in P100 for elevators, elevator classifications. One thing that we want to highlight here are some changes to MRL, or machine roomless elevators. Basically, that hydraulic MRLs are now prohibited. Traction MRLs are still allowed, but again, as it was before in previous versions, they have to be approved by the SME. Next, please. One of the other things that we want to bring up, or at least bring to your attention, is that the proper design of accessible routes must not require the use of wheelchair lifts. And so don't rely on those to overcome different areas, especially within courtrooms where you have elevated jury boxes or other items. And next, please. Family and single occupancy restrooms. Again, this is a must, and this follows, or the requirements are very similar to IBC 1109.2.1, where they're located. There has to be at least one on each accessible floor, and co-located with the separated restrooms. Again, the fixtures can be utilized within the overall count of required fixtures. There's a number of items that have been clarified in the most recent version about signage, But the one thing that may be changed is the presence of an adult or universal changing station in certain instances. And again, you'll want to check, this is only required in specific areas, specific occupancies, specific sizes of buildings. But that is a new requirement that you should be aware of. Next, please. Lactation rooms, again, this is a must for employee areas. There was a few changes in the most recent version in terms of just language, some aspects and requirements with the lactation rooms themselves. And then within the P100, there is a table that shows you the numbers based upon what the occupancy and how many people are within that area or within that tenant area. Next, please. And then bird safe building design. Again, we're looking to maintain and follow not only some of the American Bird Conservancy threat factors, but also many cities have instituted specific bird safe building design regulations. We're following a lot of those same requirements in terms of where those bird safe mostly glazing is, and it's primarily how glass should be treated at lower elevations, adjacent to green roofs, corners, and other hazard type of conditions. Next, please. The interior construction performance tables, this will cover quite a few pages within the P100. This was a much larger table before that included the interior finishes. It's now been broken into two separate sections. Karen, in the next section, we'll talk about those finishes. So here you see about 14 different categories, including doors, interior lights, aluminum frames, operable walls, millwork, countertops, those types of items. And in each category, or within each table, there is separate categories such as construction, durability, environmental factors, things that we're looking for that are laid out as requirements for those materials and installations. Next, please. And then finally, the interior performance attributes. So these follow the exact same as what you just saw in the performance table. So it's all the same items in the same row, but they actually do have additional information or separate information in each of those than the previous section. So make sure that you check both as you're looking at these kind of items and what our requirements are for each of these elements. And with that, I will hand it over to Karen Demon for interior design.
Thanks, Tim. We can go to the next slide. And as Tim said, they separated the tables out. So right here, you have all the interior finishes on a project. And the thing we'll probably cover a little more is the performance table and some of the things to note on that. So go ahead and next slide, please. Our goal when we're, updating the P100, my goal when I'm looking at this and my team's goal is, and all the finishes, we really just want to try to make the language more clear. And so one thing is maybe like less run-on sentences, reducing the ands and ors, and making more lists when we're talking about the requirements. Combine information when possible, and trying to be more consistent with the other tables in the P100. We're looking at how to protect the government's investment better. So we're looking at the warranties. One thing we have to do is kind of balance, where we want to go with what's available in the market. GSA, the largest buyer in the world, we have a lot of influence. So we really do want to be a leader in sustainability and innovation, but we also have to balance with what's fair to the rest of the industry and the market. Let's see. One thing we did this time also was trying to group like materials to have the same eco labels. And so, for example, Anything with like a vinyl flooring, anything with like a vinyl in the flooring would have the same requirements as each other. And I'll show you on another slide why that was another reason we made that change. And then let's see, make the P100 more of a living document. So we all know that things change quite often, quite frequently, especially in sustainability world. And so we wanted to just try to add more flexible language into the P100. So next slide. So this is an example of some of the tables. And so this top one is where we tried to make more flexible language. And so when we're talking about maintenance of a product, we really want to rely on our manufacturers. They know best. And so instead of citing like a, you know, an ANSI way to clean a product or maintain a product, we really want to lean on our manufacturers' recommendations because they know what's best for their particular product. And then on the environmental section, this is an example where I have the arrows pointing at baseline and tier 2. We try to make it very clear what eco labels we're going after, separating out multi-attribute certification requires, and if there's an EPD required or not. And then let's see, and then instead of having to like repeat information from baseline to tier 1, if there was no change from baseline to tier 1, we just did NA. And I believe other tables in the P100 did this as well. So just trying to make it less wordy. And then something else I want to point out in the references, I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with the green procurement compilation, but the SF tool is a great way to search for green materials. And so we wanted to reference this. And if you go to the next slide, I'll tell you why I'm excited about that. So it's not out yet. We're still in design, but the SF tool will have a button referencing the P100. And what this will do, this will, on the left side, you can see all the things that you can click when you're looking for a carpet, if you're familiar with the SF tool. If not, I would suggest going there and checking it out. Before, you would have to like look at the P100, see what baseline requirements as far as sustainability were required, click the different boxes. Well, now there'll just be a P100 checkbox, so you know that whatever you're selecting will meet the sustainability or environmental requirements, the baseline requirements for an interior product. We're hoping this is also a great way to keep things up to date if they change, since we only can update the P100 every 3 years. And so next slide. I'm just going to cover real quick or highlight that the P100 also covers interior performance attributes. Again, this is different than the table. It's just, instead of having to repeat things, it was just another section to add some information. The P100 also covers acoustics and has some great information in there as well. And then next slide. We'll cover, we have workplace requirements, which is very exciting as well. I love this section. I'm a workplace strategist as well as an interior designer. So there's a lot of awesome information in this section for you too. So please check it out and reach out if you have questions. I think that's it for me.
Hi, my name is Bill Earl. I'm Central Office Structural Engineering SME. Today, I am going to cover the first half of Chapter 4. Next slide, please. You can see that Chapter 4 is split into 2 pieces, structural engineering and civil engineering. I'm going to be covering the first half. Next slide. The structural engineering portion of this chapter is really straightforward. We pretty much cover design loads, performance criteria, and our physical security requirements. Typically, our performance criteria is really triggered at loads and design loads for our buildings. There's a little bit more information in there in terms of some prescriptive requirements, which I'll touch on as well. But our 2024 issuance really did a light hand and didn't make a lot of changes. Most of them were grammatical in error, grammatical in nature and editorial. Next slide. There were a few topics that we introduced in this issuance because they were emerging issues that were coming up. We tend to, when we bring in something new like this, kind of don't get real rigid with the requirements, but instead refer to our current guidance because the issue is evolving, as well as our guidance and how we're handling it on our projects. But this is the subjects that we added. Next slide. And then finally, the biggest changes we made is really the realignment of our baseline and our tiers for our performance requirements to be more consistent across the board. And so that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Hani Rimawi. I'm a senior civil engineer at Central Office under the Center of Engineering. I'm going to cover the second half of Chapter 4, which is civil engineering. So these are some highlights that we have here about updates that were performed to the 2024 P100. Generally minor, with the exception of the expansion of the flood mitigation flood resistant design section. Essentially, we took components from other sections, mechanical, electrical, building enclosure, and we are putting it all under the civil section under performance stable performance attributes, and I'll show you here in the next slides. Next slide, please. So just wanted to highlight some of the terminologies we're going to be using. Some of them are common, you've seen them before, but the ones to note are the top three: the design flood elevation, the flood design class, FDC, DFE, and FDC. You will see those in the performance table, and essentially they're placed in there to be interchangeable in the application of ASCE 24, and risk category RC to apply with ASCE 7 supplemental loads for flooding. And then obviously beyond that, explanations what the BFE means, 100-year elevation, which can be as well noted as the 1% annual chance flood elevation. The CISA, climate informed science approach, is one of the FFRMS floodplains, and also the term FFRMS and its explanation there with a sample of the sheet on the side. Next slide, please. So one thing I've noted, Lance noted, and Jason briefly touched on earlier is the different designation, facility designation. When it comes to flood design, flood resistance design requirements, the critical action designation is going to be focal. So the facility can be either non-critical action or critical action. It can also have other designation attached to it, whether essential or mission critical and mission essential. But for the sake of flood resistant design, we need to be able to track whether it's non-critical action and critical action. The GSA regional office will have this designation established in a coordination with the customer agency. For the A&E, we'll need you to be able to ask the question and also track this information for the life of the project, because it does have impacts on the design and also has a cost ramification. Ideally, we want to have this designation established as early as possible. So within GSA, we're working to have that as early as possible for us for the design process. Next slide, please. So here's a sample. Just wanted to show you how the floodplain information get merged into one table. So under section 4.6, civil performance table, a new subsection 4.61 is established. Underneath it, there's three components. The first component that you see here is a building enclosure and site. So essentially, building enclosure and site are merged together, and they form, and you'll see here the various performance elements that are being noted. One thing to note is that then the performance is split into two columns for the baseline through the tier. The left column is the non-critical action designation. So for example, in this case, for the baseline, the design flood elevation would be established at BFE plus 2 feet. And if the facility is designated critical action, it would be BFE plus 3 feet or the 500-year elevation, whichever is higher. And generally, you'll see these numbers and you're thinking, oh, this is probably the freeboard value approach from the FFRMS guidance, and that's pretty much what it is. And essentially, this update also reflects being in compliance with the recent executive order 14030 that reintroduced the FFRMS and for the federal government to employ. The performance also increases as you go down the tiers. It gets higher with the risk. And then also you'll see at the bottom there, the other performance that from the measurements and verifications all the way down to constructive verification, you'll see the requirements in there to be consistent with the other components as well. One thing, a couple of things to note in there is that yes, we're going to require plans and specs, but also we want to also think about whether some of those plans and specs need to be also added to the emergency action plans. So if there's one being developed for the facility, we might have those plans and specification identified and put aside to be able to carry through to the action plan. Also, we added in the references the flood study and mapping, and also added notations for the ASC 24 and ASC 7. And also new is the NSI FM 2510 reference. So essentially, we'll be looking for the American National American National Standard for flood mitigation equipment to be used, particularly with some of the equipment for flood mitigation, whether it's barriers, flood mitigation valves, or pumps that they need to be certified with that standard. Next slide, please. For mechanical, there was no performance table to grab from. It was pretty much a sentence in section 5.3, as you see there in 2022. We took that and also expanded it to match the electrical components. So for example, in the baseline on critical action, it's BFE plus 5 feet. But now when you have a critical action designation, it takes it to the next level, 500 plus 5 feet. And this will go in line with the electrical equipment as well. Next slide, please. For the electrical is combined with the generator system, and all the sections that were previously under the 2022 all combined right now here under the component here in the performance. Again, it carries similar with the mechanical. It's for us, this is something to keep it consistent. In the past, there were confusions about whether it's going to be 500 by plus 5 for mechanical electrical, but it's the same thing here for both. Next slide, please. So something we highlighted here in the attributes for the performance table, we added some clarifications and notes about floodplain data applicability. November of last year, November 2024, PBS order 1095.8A was issued with a desk guide that talks about our internal policy and how we decide in picking a site or picking a project in a floodplain. Part of that also has a list of various sources of data that we can use to establish the floodplain. FEMA information, the NFIP information being primary, but also you'll have others such as localities, counties and states that might have added information, or other sister agencies that might actually carry additional information that might not be readily available for us to use. So some detective work to take place there to find all that information relevant. Also, we noted that the study has to be relevant, current, as in dated no more than 15 years old. And also if there were no studies happening in the area, and I'm thinking about a lot of the LPOE projects that we have, then we would require a study to be conducted. The studies would be conducted with the standard of the National Flood Insurance Program, and will be certified by a PE. Also, if you have a 100-year elevation is current, but you're missing the 500-year, we added a note there that the 500 could be equated to BFE plus 3 feet. All right, but the BFE has to be up to date. So that's the other component with it. Also in coastal areas, we would allow for the CISA elevation to be utilized. The science for that elevation is available for the coastal areas only. So we're going to allow that to be substituted in the baseline for the BE and the site only component. How to go about to get that elevation number, I would refer to the FFRMS job aid. You can click on that link or even find it in the P100, and you'll be able to get to it and see how step-by-step approach. Also, we are noting again, ASC 24 guidance will be required for any flood resistant design, including dry proofing and wet proofing. components, as well as the application of ASCE 7 supplemental flood loads. The one thing that the performance table didn't note is that the flood hazard area designation is not listed because that's going to be project unique. So please be aware that whatever your project is located in connection with the FEMA map, you have to see where that falls, whether it's flood hazard, high hazard risk, or coastal, because then that sets an added risk mitigation within the ASCE 24 requirements. So that's something we'll be looking for. Also, we noted that no adverse impact. So we are a federal entity. We are going to be in a community that practices in the NFIP. So we want to make sure that whatever we build in the floodplain, we're not doing any adverse impact, or we are in compliance with the local requirement. And I'm thinking a lot of locations might have limitations for the floodplain and such. So you have to make sure that we're not pushing the water on adjacent neighbors, and we don't want that to come back to us and say, we're adding more impact. So that's something that we're going to look for in terms of like compliance. It could require having a pre and post analysis to demonstrate that. And also generally, when the design documents, we're going to be looking for a floodplain flood resistant design section, something that's one location that includes all the information for us, which includes in design narrative, plans and specifications, and also any information that need to be carried to the emergency action plan if that needs to be developed. Next slide, please. So some component element change for some of this civil under section 4.81. The stormwater design drainage moved from section 4.82, so now it's listed here. We are generally looking for compliance with SF 438. I mean, that's the law, and I think Brendan touched on based on that earlier. We're looking for compliance also with stormwater management by state and locality. So if there is a stricter requirement, that we're going to look for that to apply. We're also going to look for comparison between the two, which one would be more applicable. So heads up to that. And I think that's been echoed previously in the older chapters, older P100 versions, but this is something we're going to be looking at closely. New to this version is the performance analysis of for the drainage system for 100-year and 500-year storm events. So essentially what it is we want to understand what's the capacity of the drainage system, the conveyance, not necessarily the stormwater management facilities, the ponds being in place, but if the ponds are full, how is the water going to run through our site for the 100-year and 500-year storm events? And the reason behind that is we want to make sure that we're not making things worse for us when it comes to localized flash flooding. So we want to see, do we need interceptor ditches? Do we need to possibly increase the pipe size? Instead of using a 25-year storm event as a minimum pipe size, we might have to increase that to increase the capacity to prevent the 100-year 500 from surcharging or creating ponding location that could impact the and such and such. So it's a conveyance. Think of it as a conveyance check. How is the water going to behave? How is the water going to move through our site? We also added bicycle safe inlets requirement. Also, we included a minimum flow velocity for the piping, as well as maximum velocity not to exceed 10 feet per second to minimize any erosion of the outlets. Next slide, please. And minor comments here, update for the utilities. We're in compliance, added a section there for requirement for water recycling to be with a reference to with chapter 1 and chapter 2. And under pavement, we added non-coal tar sealant requirement to be in line with chapter 2. Next slide, please. And that's about it. Pass it to mechanical.
Thanks, Henny. Hello, everyone. My name is Bobby Wager. I'm a mechanical engineer with GSA's central office. I'm going to be providing an overview of updates to mechanical engineering chapter 5. The highlights of the updates are there's new equipment redundancy, performance tables, and air filtration requirements, as well as electrification guidance, BAS and refrigerant safety requirements, and additional guidance around maintaining domestic water systems. Next slide, please. M&V is now required for humidity control across all performance tiers. If you're familiar with those performance tables, you'll know that those tiers now require M&V for humidity control across all tiers. There's new performance robustness tables for central heating and cooling equipment. The 21 P100 had 3 equally sized machines, whether it be boilers, chillers, that were sized to meet the peak demand load of the building, or 2 at 67% apiece. we're now, that only allowed for partial redundancy. Next slide, please. So the thinking now is, as a baseline requirement, calculations should be submitted to show that if a single machine is lost, the building does not exceed design temperature set point more than 5 degrees Fahrenheit and does not exceed 60% RH. This is a performance-based approach versus the more prescriptive requirement from before. There's also an added tier performance, tier 1 performance, that arranges the equipment in more of a conventional N+1 arrangement where you have 2 pieces of equipment, each size for the peak demand load of the building. So if you were to lose a machine, you do not compromise your temperature and humidity control in the building. Next slide, please. MERV A classifications are now required for all final filtrations. You'll see those updates across all different equipment types in the updated filtration section. There's also some operation efficiency updates. There's requirements now for compliance with the more stringent ASHRAE 90.1 minimum efficiencies and FEMP minimum efficiency requirements. Also, there's added specific requirements to comply with ASHRAE 188 in an effort to stay on top of Legionella risk management for treating biological growth. Next slide, please. We've expanded on P100's all electrification requirements, as you probably heard in one of the earlier chapters. We now make reference back to Chapter 1's electrification section, and it helps consolidate a lot of the equipment, all electric equipment requirements in Chapter 5. But Chapter 5 continues to speak to the all electric equipment types that are to be pursued in new designs. Next slide, please. List of permitted roof-mounted equipment now includes air source heat pumps and condensing units, and makes reference to Chapter 3's roof waterproofing requirements to ensure consistency when installing equipment supports or dunnage that will require interfacing with the roof membrane. Next slide, please. There's been extensive updates under the building automation system section. Particularly specific references have been made now to the building technologies technical reference guide. That's a mouthful. But if you are not already familiar with that and you deal with, compliance with building automation systems and GSA projects, please familiarize yourself with that. And there's additional coordination language now clarifying coordination with GSA smart buildings personnel to ensure that those systems are maintaining consistency with the building automation standards that we provide. Next slide, please. We added additional guidance for equipment coils exposed to urban and marine environments to mitigate NOx and SOx corrosion. Some references have been provided, but essentially aluminum fins are required to have electrocoating and preferable to copper fins with NOx SOx coatings for protection from fossil fuel combustion products for those lower intakes along a building's facade in an urban environment. Next slide, please. There's been specific reference now made to ASHRAE 15 and 34 in terms of added refrigerant safety standards, especially as it relates to volume concentration limits and the routing of refrigerant containing piping, which must maintain accessibility so that you could mitigate against any sort of leaks. And one minor update is that cooling coil condensate piping must be type L copper. Next slide, please. This I don't think was previously immediately obvious, but all ductwork for all conventional system types must be galvanized sheet metal unless otherwise indicated. And regarding the use of flex ductwork, there's a 5-foot maximum limit for flexible ductwork. And a reminder that flex ducts are not permitted above hard ceilings, only accessible ceilings. Next slide, please. Where practical and cost effective, cool air rejected from an air source heat pump that is in heating mode is to be recovered and delivered to adjacent spaces requiring cooling, such as electric or IT closets. That's a brand new requirement for this year. Next slide, please. There's been a lot of new requirements added to the plumbing section. Just to summarize a few, there's added guidance on flushing procedures for newly installed domestic water systems. There's also new requirements to provide recirc loops at the end of all cold water risers and major distribution to encourage flushing. And isolation valves are required on all branch distribution in rooms that contain more than one domestic water fixture, such as bathrooms or other spaces that are off the core area. Hose bibs are to be provided every 100 feet along building perimeter, and floor drains are required in all rooms provided with domestic water fixtures. Overflow pans are also required to be provided under domestic hot water heater storage tanks. Next slide, please. Yeah, I bumped through explaining all of these. Next slide. Hose bibs, floor drains. Yep. Accessibility for maintenance. Just a point of reinforcement here. Split air-cooled systems must reject heat outside of the building envelope. Outdoor equipment shall not be installed in stores and not within mechanical rooms, unless they're designed to be indoor units and fully ducted systems. That's something that may sound obvious, but it's now a written requirement in P100. Next slide, please. For equipment alterations in existing buildings, direct replacement in kind of aged out equipment is not permitted. Specifically size all new equipment for current and future programmatic needs for spaces and questions. This is an attempt to get ahead of getting equipment that is improperly sized just because it was easier to see what the old equipment was and put in new equipment of the same size. That may not be most appropriate. That is all for me. I'll hand it over now to Ben Pisarcik for the electrical engineering updates.
All right, thank you, Bobby. Chapter 6, Electrical Engineering, we'll be discussing lighting and power. So the first general slide I have here, or first of all, let me back up. Updates or changes to the 2024 P100 reminders are things that may have been in P100 for many years. We're just bringing them up. They come up often. So compliance with P100 waivers. P100 compliance is mandatory. Waivers are considered for project unique circumstances. Waivers are for pre-installed deviations are not granted after the fact, and P100 waivers are not granted for cost. We encourage those of you that may have a potential waiver to reach out to us, and we can discuss that with you, give you an idea of whether it may or may not be approved, and help you craft the language for the waiver itself. We appreciate all the suggestions and everything that we get. We take those very seriously, and we go through when we update P100 and incorporate where we can. Before I move from this slide, though, I want to point out that all of the previous training sessions that we've had this summer for all the chapters in P100 can be found at gsa.gov/P100. The slides and the recordings are there for you to view. So moving into lighting, all new lighting for GSA must be LED. We upgraded from DLC, which is Design Lights Consortium, standard 5.0 to 5.1, deals with efficacy, efficiency, and that sort of thing. And we added Luna 1.0. This is for exterior fixtures, so that is new to P100. We've included as appropriate because once in a while there may be a specific application where you may not be able to find a DLC listed fixture, and we expect the lighting designer to look at those on a case-by-case basis, provide a quality installation. So lighting controls, we also included Dolly 2. Individually addressable fixtures are not required. ASHRAE 90.1 compliance 2019 is required, but in the event that you do have an individually addressable system, you must follow Dolly 2, D4I, which deals more with sensors, interfacing with HVAC, and those sorts of things. Power over Ethernet, just like Dolly 2, is not a requirement, but if you do install a PoE installation, there are several bullets here. I'm not going to read them all that you need to adhere to for that installation. The intent is for the ease of maintenance, the longevity of the system, and ensuring that heat buildup, heat gain, and that doesn't affect the system over time. So retrofits. We have a lot of this going on throughout GSA, ESPC projects and the like. UL listing must be maintained. The retrofits must be DLC, must have dimmable drivers, meet IES guidelines, and a mock-up is required. Installing 4,000 fixtures, we want to make sure that they're going to serve the purpose as intended. So we want to do that mock-up in advance. And the last bullet, the retrofit must be approved by the local SME, which is typically the regional electrical engineer. In their absence, Jeff Seatram or myself can deal with that. So for retrofits continued, we have TLEDs, which are tubular LEDs. Type A use the existing ballast. It's a short-term solution because ballast are going away, not making them any longer. Type B is now prohibited in P100 due to safety reasons and the inability of control for these lamps. So we prefer Type C, which uses a LED driver and a luminaire, which is very similar to an actual LED luminaire. So moving into power. This first bullet here is not new to P100, but we have rewritten this section a few times to try to capture our intent. So we do require draw-out switchgear UL 1558 for any service that's 1200 amps or greater. Switchboards UL 891 can be used for under 1200 amps. All switchgear, the second bullet is brand new to P100. All switchgear and switchboard panels must have hinged covers in lieu of removable covers for safety purposes. Spare capacity and ampacity. I won't read all of the bullets here, but I want to point out that GSA's requirements are a bit higher than industry standard. You can see the 50% there on the panel boards. And so I encourage you to familiarize yourself with this. And the intent here is we have these facilities in our inventory for a very long time, and this provides resiliency and flexibility for us to do what we need to do over the years while we own these buildings. One new part to the spare capacity is we added new components of the electrical system. So let me explain that. Had a lot of folks say I'm adding a couple of outlets for a pantry or something like that, and now I'm not going to have the spare capacity that you require. Well, that spare capacity, that's what that's there for, to add a lighting circuit, a couple of outlets, something along those lines. But if you have a project that's large enough that you're going to install a new panel board, then you do need to plan for that spare capacity or a switchboard light. So hopefully that makes sense and clears that up. Electric rooms. Some of these are industry standard and some are GSA specific. So we want our electric rooms stacked in core areas. We want them accessible on the perimeter walls. I've seen a lot of core area electric rooms that have elevator shafts, HVAC shafts, and things like that around them. We cannot distribute out to our loads if we're surrounded by non-penetrable walls. 6 by 10 is the minimum size for electric room. You can make them larger. They serve no more than 10,000 square feet. That's unique to GSA. The intent there is to limit voltage drop situations and also to not disturb. There could be multiple tenants on a floor. We want to kind of, stay close to our electric room and distribute accordingly throughout those spaces. Branch circuits limited to 120 feet or less. Again, that goes along with the voltage drop. We don't want to be upsizing conductors and things like that. And then last, 30% spare wall space. As you can see in the sketch on the left-hand side, there is very little space, if any, in that room to install a new panel board in the future if we may need to do that. So we do require 30% spare wall space for future adds. Generators, the first 4 bullets here are reminders. The last 2 were changed quite a bit. We used to, in previous versions of P100, we limited gas generators at 350 kW, and we now say we recommend diesel for 500 kW and larger. And we also changed our duct bank percentages based on NFPA 110 testing requirements, 20% for gas, so that there's some load there, and 75% for diesel for the testing requirements. Arc flash, please read this section and be familiar. All of these slides have will be made available and have the section numbers above here, but the final studies are to be completed by the contractor once equipment selections and things are made. The model must be provided, the SKM model or whatever that calculator or that study is done in must be provided for us for future use to give to maybe another contractor to modify in the future. Any work affecting the distribution system that's going to impact the study needs to be updated and part of that project. And if there's not a model for a particular building and 25% or greater is being impacted of the electrical distribution, then a model will need to be generated. Last slide, MC cable. We prohibit MC cable under most circumstances. We do allow it, and would like for you to read these bullets in detail, but one thing that we do wholeheartedly prohibit is termination directly to the panel board. You can see the pictures here with the MC cable terminating to the panel board. We don't want to see that in any of our spaces. We require conduit out to the first wiring device, and then there's several other areas such as a critical equipment or highly finished space where we require that conduit to be installed so that we can access it at a later date. So we do allow it, but under specific requirements. And with that, I will turn it over to Dave Frable, our fire protection engineer. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. My name is Dave Frable, and I'm the manager of the National Fire Protection Program. For this presentation, I'll be starting out by providing an overview on some fundamental topics that I feel impact the fire protection portion on most projects. And then I will discuss a few new major updates in Chapter 7. The first topic I would like to discuss is the role and the responsibility that has been assigned to the GSA Regional Fire Protection Program. Please note that the GSA Regional Fire Protection Office functions as the responsible party to make interpretations and enforcement decisions regarding fire protection issues whenever the terms building official, fire code official, or authority having jurisdiction is used in codes and standards, depending on the application. Next slide, please. The second topic for discussion is the qualifications of the fire protection engineer on the project team staff. The project team's fire protection engineer must meet all of the qualification requirements outlined in Chapter 7. One of the key requirements is that we want a licensed engineer in fire protection. We do not want a licensed mechanical engineer designing our sprinkler systems, a licensed electrical engineer designing our fire alarm systems, or an architect performing egress calculations or code analysis. No offense to these other engineering disciplines, but in the past, this issue has led to disagreements between the Regional Fire Protection Program Office and the project team staff, and in some cases, has caused project delays. Next slide. The third topic to discuss is waivers. Please note that waivers for fire protection requirements are not permitted. In lieu of waivers, the Regional Fire Protection Program Office will consider proposed alternatives that provide an equivalent compliance solution that meets the intent of the requirements in P100. Next slide. That being said, the fourth topic to discuss is alternative and equivalent compliance. This process is used in lieu of waivers for any deviation of fire protection requirements in P100. Proposed alternatives must be evaluated by the GSA Regional Fire Protection Program Office and deemed as an equivalent design solution in meeting the intent of the fire protection requirements in P100. Next slide, please. Now I will discuss a few of the major updates in Chapter 7. The first update I would like to discuss is on the 4 new responsibilities for the project team's fire protection engineer. The 4 additional responsibilities are that the fire protection engineer must review all submittals related to fire protection systems, review all RFIs and change orders, verify by inspection that all fire protection systems installed meet the design requirements, and lastly, they must also participate in witnessing preliminary testing of all fire protection systems and confirm that the results met the design parameters. The second update is on the new requirements for parking structures. All parking structures, open and closed, must now be protected with an automatic sprinkler system and a Class 1 standpipe system. These new requirements are based on recent research by the NFPA Fire Protection Research Foundation and are also based on the latest requirements in NFPA 88, the standard for parking structures. The third update is on the new section on modular rooms. This new section was added to address the new hazards associated with modular rooms that are now being installed within our buildings. The new requirements address sprinkler protection, fire alarm system audibility, egress reliability, and a minimum separation distance of 18 inches between each modular unit. Next slide, please. Now, the fourth update is on sleep pods. This section was added because installation of sleep pods in our buildings could affect the occupancy classification, as well as the fire protection requirements for the building due to occupants sleeping within our buildings or spaces. To address this concern, sleep pods are now prohibited to being installed in our buildings. The fifth update is on electrical vehicle supply equipment. This section was added in P100 to correlate with the fire protection requirements stipulated in Chapter 8, Section 8.5 that will be discussed shortly. And finally, I've added a link to P100 so that when you do have an opportunity You can access Chapter 7 to see all of the other revisions in more detail. I will now pass the presentation over to Jeff to discuss Chapter 7.
All right, thanks, Dave. Good information there. So I'm Jeff Future. I'm an electrical engineer with GSA's Center for Engineering, along with Ben, who we just heard from earlier on Chapter 6 there. Chapter 8, we may sometimes forget it's hanging around back here, but hopefully over the next few minutes, you'll come to realize that there's some pretty useful information back here. Chapter 8 deals with specialty spaces, covers multiple disciplines as they relate to those particular spaces. That kind of sets it apart from the other chapters there. So this list here, you can see what spaces are included. We start out with the U.S. courts. Yes, there's more than just the Marshals Pub 64 when it comes to the court projects. This has several pages dealing with particular spaces and systems as they relate to the courthouses there. Land ports of entry, we have a reserve section for future use, so it's kind of silent for now. Mail rooms and indoor firing ranges are included here. They basically call out references that should be incorporated into projects. Then we have the big item here. Those 4 items didn't change too much, but item 8.5, this is new to Chapter 8 here. So this is deals with EVSE. It used to reside back in Chapter 6. With the expansion of accessibility and fire protection components, we combined everything together into one area, so you're not you wouldn't stand a chance of jumping between multiple chapters and inadvertently missing something along the way. So diving right into EVSE here, so major changes this cycle beyond the relocation include incorporation of the interim guidance packages for both accessibility and fire protection. We've increased the ratio of GOVs to charging ports. It was roughly 3 to 1, now it's 2 to 1. And finally, we did some general updates from lessons learned as we got a few of these projects under our belt. First item that always comes up when it comes to EVSE is what might the effort include, when do we need to include it? So EVSE needs to be installed for any project that is significantly modifying or installing parking lots or garages. That includes resurfacing. To think about it, we don't want to repave the lot and then come back 3 months later and trench it all up to lay down some conduit. So next up, we have the order of preference listed out here. We don't always have options available to us, but when they do exist, outdoor surface lots are our first choice. Then roof levels of a parking structure, think open to the sky. And finally, any other parking locations. As we work our way down this preference order here, the installation gets more involved and complex with equates to being more expensive. So on this slide here, the next thing you're going to see is this table. If you use the P100, use these tables here, but this one's a little bit different. It's going to go into a little bit here. So EVSE needs are based upon how the vehicles are actually used. We shouldn't try to make this a one-size-fits-all scenario. Federal agencies, their needs are very different from one another. So depending on how they drive the car, they may need different tier levels here. So within a single building, you're apt to see multiple tier levels across that building. You'll notice just one last thing to call attention to here is on the baseline levels as minimum levels. You'll see that for government vehicles there, like I mentioned, the one charging port for every two GOVs, that's the minimum. And then the baseline KW level is what will likely be our workhorse model for most of our installations, is a level 2 charger at 6.6 kW. All right, so on the next slide. Back one, there we go, yes, yep. So 851 has a whole laundry list of items in there. Not going to go into them all, don't have time. But one item I'm going to call your attention because it comes up on every single project. So the EVSE construction IDIQs, they have to procure the chargers off the EVSE blanket purchase agreement. In addition to that, the chargers must be network capable, FedRAMP approved, and ATO certified. That's all that ATA's, the IT security protocols and all that stuff back there. It needs to pass all that stuff before we can install them in a GSA facility. There are only a couple of manufacturers that meet all that presently, but more are in the process. So just remember, if you're preparing specs for EVSE, your base model, any alternate part numbers are like that. You need to make sure that they comply with all that stuff there. There aren't that many of them out there. All right, on the next slide, for GOV requirements, government operated vehicles. The most important element is that complete and operational chargers will need to be included as part of the project. That hasn't changed, but it's always worth repeating. Power sharing, charge management possibilities need to be looked at. Not only we may have some ampacity limits, but we also need to protect ourselves from exposure to peak demand chargers. Many GOVs, just by the way they're operated, they have high overnight dwell times. We need to ensure that we're recharging these vehicles in the most efficient and least costly manner. The next slide deals with POVs, private operated vehicles. We only require infrastructure support in the P100, though individual projects may require more than that. Then we spell out what percentage of the spaces, how many spaces, depending upon the size of the lot there, that we need to address for POVs. Next slide deals with accessibility. GSA follows the US Access Board requirements. Every parking area with EV charging shall include at least one accessible charging space. If the parking area has both level 2 and level 3 charging, then each charging level will have at least one accessible charging space. If the building has several separate parking lots and each of those has separate EV charging, each of those separate lots will have an accessible charging space. One thing to note here is that the charging spaces are under use last designation. So all vehicles have the right to use those, whether the driver needs accessible parking or not. But basically, they would have to use all the other available charging spots first, and then if none other are available, they could use the accessible charging spot. So there'll be signage to that effect at these sites here. Next up, we're going to go to fire protection. Dave mentioned we're going to talk about it, so here it is. If you're installing EVSE in a parking structure, it'll need to have automatic sprinkler protection throughout and have Class 1 standpipe for the fire department. If you're dealing with surface parking lots, there are separation distances called out from both the buildings and vegetation. Then there's manual power disconnects required for all level 2 and level 3 chargers. They should be located such that first responders can isolate the chargers in the event of emergency. You don't want to put them right next to the chargers. You want to put them some distance on, like, so when the fire department comes in, they pass this emergency power off button there, and then they can go to the chargers to get access to the chargers after that. So that wraps up our section here on Chapter 8. I'm going to pass things back over to Lance Davis to talk about the appendix and some cool P100 tools.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so here we are in the appendix, about to wrap all of this up. Next, one of the things that everyone should be aware of, we do require the use of BIM. That's been a requirement since 2009. And then we also require that our equipment is modeled using Kobe, and that's been since 2015. So those are important aspects to remember. Next. We have a couple great tools that are in the appendix. One of them is 8.2. So everyone's been talking about all these various performance tiers. And as a designer or as a contractor, you could see how it could get very confusing as to what tier am I supposed to be designing to, or what tier am I supposed to be constructing. So this is a great document for our project managers to really note what we're looking for contractually, and then for our design teams or our design build teams to note any betterments that they're able to provide throughout the process. And so that way we know exactly what we're all working on, the reviewers know what they're looking at, and we have a pretty clear understanding of what's happening here. Next. The next really cool tool we have is a submittal matrix. We realized the previous versions really only dealt with design, bid, build. We spent a lot of time and energy spreading this out to our 4 main delivery types. And so this is a tool you can use. And so next slide. You can see here's what happens if you select design, bid, build. It brings up this really neat graphic. You see all the different delivery phases that you have in a design, bid, build project. Next slide. And so if we select, say, final concept and the sustainability tab, this tells you exactly what we're looking to see in your submittals, so where that we can verify that the project is meeting P100 and moving through in a substantial manner. And so hopefully this will greatly clarify what you need to be providing the government to prove that you're meeting P100. I will say we are in the process of updating this, and we expect the new version for this 2024 P100 to be out in the next couple of weeks. Next. And then finally, or close to finally, we have added a new section, 8.6, which gets much more in depth on life cycle cost analysis requirements. Next. And so it clearly outlines for different project types and their submission levels exactly what's being required for that analysis to be done. So that should greatly clarify for design teams what they need to be working on and what they need to be providing here. Next. And then finally, probably one of the more important things to know about P100 is Appendix C.1. That tells you exactly what has changed from the previous version of P100. So if you knew the 2021 with addendum extremely well. You can see what those changes are, how the chapters have been moved or adjusted, or what new sections have come in. So this is a really great help for our project managers and design teams to really understand P100. Next slide. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. It's been noted before, but we'll say it again, that both the P100, all the tools, as well as the various training slides and these latest videos are all posted on gsa.gov/P100. And I think we're going to leave the session open for a few minutes to finish answering any questions that may come in. But otherwise, thank you for your attention. Hopefully you got a lot of great information out of all of this. And if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.